Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, where industry leaders share insights on innovation with a focus on reducing cost and improving security for federal technology. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. In the studio today, we have Reggie Townsend, Vice President, Data Ethics at SAS. Everyone knows the company. It's been around a long time. Anyone who's involved in the federal government understands what their role is. They've been around for many, many decades. And what I wanted to do today is bring in an expert from SAS to talk about his perspective on artificial intelligence. It's a topic that's been around for many, many years, and all of a sudden we have a big spike. I'm sure if you went to Google Trends, you'd see a long-term, all of a sudden a big spike coming up in artificial intelligence. And I thought we'd bring in someone who's a well-known expert on artificial intelligence, and I think he's most famous for being friends with Dr. Stephen Bennett, aren't you?
Well, if that's my claim to fame, then I will take it, man. Yes, I know Steve very well.
Yeah, he speaks to federal agencies. He's very well respected in this area, that's for sure. So my question to you is, in October of 2022, we have the Executive Office of the President, the big dogs. They come up with a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. Why now? Why not 10 years ago or 20 years ago? What's going on?
Well, AI is part of the national conversation, to be sure. It has been a part of certain communities' conversation for quite some time. You know, the federal government established the National AI Advisory Committee and the National AI Office some time ago. And so the attention that AI is getting today, and deservedly so, I think largely is a function of, the big event with ChatGPT last November, and the introduction of large language models to the national vernacular. This is technology that's been around for quite some time. SAS is an example. We've been dabbling in this sort of capability for quite some time with natural language processing as an example. And so again, deservedly so, understandably so. The conversation has spiked, right? We are, on the threshold of the hype cycle, if you will, with respect to AI. So I would argue that the conversation is certainly not new, but it is certainly far more voluminous today.
And I think the big fancy word voluminous is appropriate. I was listening to an interview with a guy named Sunny Bagawalia, and he's well known. And I was writing down some notes. He said, every day the Customs and Borders Protection, their agency, they have 10 billion transactions, 50 billion data exchanges, and they're running on 175 petabytes on its network. I mean, you can't do that with Reggie in a spreadsheet. I mean, how do you manage all that? It's not me and Steve and Reggie in the back room with a hand calculator figuring. But this is the problem today, isn't it? I mean, these large data sets, you have to respond with maybe something equally large to manage them. That's
exactly right. We've been kind of the kings, if you will, of big data for quite some time, and have done a lot of that big data work with and for the government. The issue that you point out here, John, is poignant in that, we have so much digitized these days that is creating far more data than we've ever seen literally in the history of mankind. And so the question is, how do you manage that data? How do you gain adequate levels of access with appropriate levels of trust and security? How do you prepare that data and govern it in ways that are appropriate? And then what do you do with it, right? So we like to say the single most important indicator of success with AI is models in production that help you derive decisions. And so you can have tons of data, but if you can't develop models from that data, optimize those models over time, make sure that they remain valid, and then actually deploy some insights as a consequence of those models, then you've just got a bunch of data. And so that's the space that we're in. So when we talk about AI, really it's about operationalizing the AI lifecycle, which includes all of that data management and model development and model management and so on. So that's the space that we play in when we talk about AI.
So Reggie, I wrote down tons of data, and I reflect on back when you were in college. You maybe took a political science course and you learned about this survey they did. I think it was around 1930s, maybe 100 years ago. And they did a telephone survey of an election to see who was going to win. And the telephone survey said that candidate A was going to win. However, the survey results came in and they were all wrong because the other candidate won. They had a biased data set, didn't they? And so I think we can talk with tons of data. And maybe these people who did the telephone survey, maybe they called 10,000 people and maybe they had what they thought was a big data set there. But when you get tons of data, it's got to be fair. It can't be biased data, can it? I mean, you can't, interview everyone in Ohio and Illinois, ask them if it's cold in the winter and decide it's cold in California in the winter. So this bias set with these tons of data, I think this is something people don't talk about enough. Yeah,
I think understanding bias is important here. The first thing I like to acknowledge is that bias is a part of the human condition, right? It's part of what helps us as humans sort through in an efficient way in how we will pursue our endeavors in life. So I don't know that we'll ever look to get rid of bias, or we shouldn't look to get rid of bias because humans have that. I think what we importantly have to do is I think you were calling out here, John, is understand how that bias is affecting our decisions. And if those decisions are being implemented on the basis of biases that ultimately either give us inaccurate outcomes like the one you're pointing out, or more insidiously hurt other people, then that's problematic. And the conversation around bias in AI right now is usually associated with the latter, which is to ensure that the data that we're being that is being managed, collected, accessed, used in models ultimately doesn't come to the dismay, right? Isn't used to the dismay of folks who are generally speaking already marginalized in our society. And so, the issue for me is, from a platform provider perspective, is putting, say, developers as an example in the best possible position to understand when and how they're using data that might be used in ways that are potentially harmful. So just to give you a practical example, being able to mark data attributes as sensitive or private, right, becomes really important if you're thinking about issues like gender. And we have the ability with certain techniques to be able to through proxy determine gender of a person, ethnicity of a person, et cetera. And so with that ability, what decisions then are you making? And so the capability of being able to mark those data in ways that, say, all right, we're going to not allow, a certain cohort of folks to have access to this data because, we don't want them to see it because they might be able to misuse or abuse it, is a really important step to make. And so we, want to put, developers and technologists writ large and executives writ large in a best possible position to make choices. I like to call them willful choices about who they will and won't affect.
Reggie, for the last 10 years, I've taught in the graduate school at Georgetown University. And when you submit your structure for the course, every course has to have an ethics component to it. Math, ethics, history, ethics, talk about any topic there, project management, you kind of have an ethical component. Well, maybe because your title is, Vice President Data Ethics, maybe you got to go to the University of Chicago, knock on their door and go, well, hey, what kind of ethical, guidelines are you giving the students there? This, the computer science students. It seems like it's coming big circle to the old, like the old school values there of ethical things. But that seems to be what has to happen now, doesn't it?
You're exactly right. And I think that is starting to happen throughout courses in a lot of universities. Ethics, I talk about ethics in terms of social consensus, and, the computer scientists, the data scientists, the technologists writ large are a part of a broader society. And so while technical decisions can be made, technical capabilities can be created, you have to always consider how those capabilities are deployed in a broader society. Mathematical accuracy does not equate to justice, right? And so we have to understand, if we are attempting to optimize for a certain outcome, if in the end that optimization ends up, further marginalizing or discriminating or entrenching a certain values that we would rather not be entrenched, then we need to take a different course, right? We need to perhaps, mute the capability or, in some way diminish it, right?
Yeah.
And so these are some of the broader topics that we have to think about, not just from a technical perspective, but from a tech policy perspective, right? AI is a ubiquitous technology, meaning it will show up in a myriad of ways throughout our lives. And so it then creates a consequence around socio-technical choices that we have to make. And this is the day that we're in. And I mean, this is why I enjoy this space, this data ethics space, because it forces us to explore a multitude of domains from, let's face it, philosophy and religion all the way through, hardcore engineering and everything in between.
Well, I'm glad you talked about the math. 2 days ago, I interviewed a woman with a PhD in math. And we know a lot of PhDs out there. And so you could have someone like John Gilroy walk up to you and go, well, Reggie, the math is all good on this. This math is great. You can't argue with the math. But Reggie's going to sit back and say, show me your work. I mean, how did you get that information? The political survey I talked about earlier, what they did is they called up people with telephones and they did a survey that way. And I bet you, Dr. Steve Bennett could look and say, yeah, the math is great on that survey. And Reggie would say, the math is great. But what about the thought processes before the math? I mean, I think that's the magic sauce there, is that, hey, the math is the easy part. I think in ethics, it's like, let's talk about the basic concepts before you get out your big spreadsheets and everything else. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And, you mentioned the AI Bill of Rights earlier. The idea, part of the idea behind that is to start with this notion that that individuals, right, as citizens, there's a certain set of rights that we are enabled with as citizens. In corporate spaces, we take a similar approach in some corporate spaces. Anyway, I'll speak to SaaS, right? We start with this idea of human centricity. And the point that I want to make here is the technology has to follow the principle of human centricity. So, we're going to start off with this idea of, do our products and services enable agency, equity, and well-being first? And if they don't, then we need to go and reconsider the products and services. And I think, the government is seeking to take a similar approach, which is, if there are a set of imbued rights, if you will, are those rights being enabled or diminished? And based on that output, you need to make a choice about how the technology then is deployed. Now, government has a number of different reasons for why it might deploy technology, either for, the benefit of being more efficient within its space to provide benefits, as an example. But at the same time, it has to be, very efficient in terms of things like national security. Those have very different consequences as it relates to the well-being of an individual life, right? So we have to be mature about this conversation and recognize that there are, a multitude of use cases, if you will, and we have to be careful about how the AI then gets deployed within each of those disparate use cases.
So, Reggie, we're going to give you a little test here, a connect the dots test. I'm going to give you 2 quotes, and you got to connect the dots here, and they got nothing to do with AI. One quote is about Johnny Carson, and one quote is about Pew Research. So Johnny Carson, 1957, he started a TV show called Who Do You Trust? Yeah, he did. Lasted for a few years. Separate piece of the puzzle. Pew Research did a survey, and they said that 20% of Americans don't trust government. So we got a trust factor here. So, Reggie, who do you trust? I mean, what numbers do you trust? And how do you imbue trust into people who listen to your speaking and listen to this podcast? I mean, we can talk about trust all day long, but how do you trust these numbers? What's the best practice for this?
Yeah, so I'll give you one additional data point that you may or may not be familiar with, talk about quite a bit.
Johnny Carson?
Well, no, not Johnny Carson. As much as I love Mr. Carson, I would have an opportunity to stay up late night at 10:30 here Central and watch the monologue, and then I'd have to go to sleep. So the Edelman Trust Barometer, I don't know if you're familiar with the work that they do at Edelman, but on an annual basis, they publish this barometer, and they look at major institutions. Now, it's a global index. But over the last couple of years, what's been interesting to see is that they've got this quadrant of ethical to unethical on the vertical axis and competent to incompetent on the horizontal. And basically what they do is look at four major institutions: business, NGOs, media, and government. And what it shows is that 2023, government right now is seen as both unethical and incompetent, which is problematic. Now, that is a pretty significant shift, I might add, from 2020, right? It's a precipitous decline. Now, if you think about what's happened in 2020, we were all dealing with a pandemic globally. We saw some fracturing of democratic values literally around the world. And so what this latest barometer tells us, or suggesting anyway, is that right now business is the only one that's being seen as both ethical and competent, which represents, I think, an opportunity for business to help close that trust gap with government, with media, et cetera, through its technology capabilities. Now, the question that you're fundamentally asking is, how can people trust the technology? Well, the technology itself is relatively agnostic. So that's like asking, how can I trust a hammer? Trusting the people, trusting the processes that surround the technology, I think, is the important piece that we cannot overstate. And so having government put processes in place that are trustworthy, because you can't force people to trust you. You can only behave in trustworthy ways. So putting processes in place that are transparent, that are explainable, you're holding up the Bill of Rights, right? That's a starting point. But then having people that are illustrative, right, who are, if you will, walking the walk as well as talking the talk, is the next piece. Now, as it relates to AI and the government, I've had the great fortune of having an opportunity to kind of see some people and meet some people over my last couple of years here, doing work with the NIAC and such. I can tell you for a fact that there are a lot of serious people in the government who are focused on AI. And for now, it is not a politicized matter. And that's a really good thing. It does concern me that if it becomes politicized, what could happen? But again, fortunately, we've got a really solid number of legislators, as well as staff and all the rest of it, and all of the rest of the ecosystem that are very serious about the topic of AI and are very astutely and very thoughtfully thinking about how to put the proper measures of, say, regulation in place and those sorts of things. So, I'm always a kind of realistic optimist, but I'm leaning into that quite a bit right now, John, because of what I'm seeing emerge. There are going to be people who say, we're moving too slow and that sort of thing. I get it. But, government should not move at the speed of the market. Right. So I'll leave it at that. I think when it comes to trust,
I mean, if someone walked up to me and said, "Hey, I got this black box here. You do this, and this comes out of the end here." Well, what's inside? I think maybe that's what this blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights is all about. It says, okay, it seems kind of mysterious, artificial intelligence. However, if we can make sure there's fairness and explainable processes and robustness and transparency and data priority, well, maybe we can earn that trust by being transparent. And I think that's what, NIST has some guidelines for artificial intelligence, and the executive office has guidelines for that. And I think possibly even SAS has guidelines for that. But I think that's going to restore trust in individuals going, well, yeah, maybe I can trust. And when it comes to I get medical things, I mean, right now we see artificial intelligence being able to make radiological diagnoses that are better than doctors can. And so I think with something almost mechanical, you can really easily trust it, or maybe review legal documents, another thing. But when it comes to ethical things and human beings, boy, that gets so sticky there, doesn't it?
It does. And this is why, I'm believing when you're looking at deploying AI that you've got to be very particular with where you start, right? So let's break it down for a second. AI fundamentally is about automated decision making. So you take all this data that we talked about earlier, and then you build some, models around or algorithms around how you want to deal with this data in order to derive a certain set of decisions. We make thousands of decisions a day. And that just is exponential when you start putting us into organizations, particularly places like the federal government. And so with all of these decisions, some of them are proven, right? We know, X input equals Y output all the time, right? So they're proven, reliable, and in some cases, they're relatively laborious, right? They just demand more energy than they create output. And so those are the situations where I think models make sense, where we put AI to make automated decisions on our behalf. You always need to keep humans in the loop and that sort of thing to ensure that the models aren't decaying over time and that they're actually doing what we want them to do. So, think about your audience for a second. I'm thinking a lot of folks are understaffed, underpaid, right? The government has a really tough time competing with the market with respect to tech talent, right? So you've got to find ways to put technology in places to help be more efficient in your day-to-day work. So then how do you do that in a way that is, as you said, is transparent and explainable, with zero trust and security, right? All of this. So, I know at least at SAS, we take those sorts of considerations into account. We actually bake that into the platform. So, most of folks are, say, moving to the cloud as an example. You got to make sure that you maintain some levels of agility and resilience at the same time managing costs, because taxpayers are only going to pay for so much, right? But what we're seeing is when people move to the cloud, they're getting sticker shock because of the consumption costs associated with the cloud. So this is where things like compute and storage become really important to manage, right? So at the end of the day, what I'm suggesting is that the architecture matters here. So we're taking all of that into account when we're, developing our capabilities and providing them to the government. We want to make sure that you can be highly performant in the cloud or on-prem as necessary. And we go both ways. And that you have some of the fastest ability to compute these models, right? Because models getting trained can sometimes take hours, days, weeks, right? And so you want to be able to do that as quickly as possible. And in ways that are highly explainable and digestible, not just by the most hardcore technologists, but also by the executives who have to help make some of the decisions around budget and so on. And so, those are the kinds of things that we're taking into account. And, our VIA platform, as an example, has, I think, done quite well in terms of the analyst remarks and that sort of thing to suggest that what I'm sharing with you is actually true.
So, Reggie, I want to maybe take and move on to looking at the future here and seeing what's going on. And you use this phrase. I wrote this phrase down: baked into the platform. Okay, baked into the platform. So what is baked into the platform here? There are people that are scared of what's baked into the platform. And here's a quote. Here's a quote from Tristan Harris. Here we go. Center for Human Technology. 50% of researchers believe there's a 10% chance humans will grow extinct from our inability to control AI. Bye-bye, Reggie. What do you think of that? That's a wild statement.
Yeah. I get a chance to do a lot of these kinds of conversations, right?
I know. You're smiling. I know what's going on.
Yeah, I get the question a fair amount. And look, very smart people are very serious about this existential issue. If I were able to just kind of wave the wand, I would put maybe 1% to 2% of my really smart people on that issue. And I'd let the other 98 to 99% of the people focus on the issues of the day. We have a lot of concerns with respect to how data is collected, what data is used about certain folks, how we might be able to mass data, what decisions are being made as a consequence of the AI systems that are already deployed, let alone those that may be deployed at some point in the future. We have concerns around surveillance and, law enforcement. We have concerns around whether or not folks are getting adequate access to capital. We have concerns around whether people are being treated in healthcare setting in appropriate ways based on, their demographic makeups and all the rest of it, right? So I think we have enough to be concerned with today. And we have a lot of capabilities baked into, say, our platform at SAS and others do as well that deal with things associated with, bias detection and privacy and security and the ability to explain how we're doing. So, the whole black box phenomenon is actually one that I think is diminishing. Not everyone has diminished, but certainly from our vantage point, we try to be as explainable as possible. There is always the possibility of some existential force, be it, the planets are going to collide or there's going to be nuclear holocaust or whatever, right? Put 1% to 2% of the people on that and make sure that they mitigate the risk associated with whatever that possibly might be. But for the rest of us, let's deal with the issues of the day, because there are people who are hurting today that we can help. And I think if we are really concerned about human beings, let's deal with the ones who are hurting right in front of us.
Yeah, and I think that's the lesson I've learned when I talk to people about bias, and there are systems that can exclude people from some of the benefits that the government provides. And I think if you understand exactly more about artificial intelligence and you're working for the federal government, at least you can add your 2 cents into asking questions about where people derive this data from and find out where it was trained on, and maybe SAS has the answer for them. Maybe just listening to one of your lectures has the answer for them. And maybe, Reggie, maybe this podcast will help someone in the DOD solving a completely different problem where they're taking data sets and they're all biased in just one area. And it's going to lead them into human beings dying because of a bias in a data set that artificial intelligence said, yes, this is going to work. So I think I like to be humorous and talk about Johnny Carson, but there's people from the DOD that make life and death decisions on analyzing data sets, and you have to get serious every now and then, as hard as that is for me.
Yeah, I get it. And you're right. There are a number of situations where, we show up and others show up. Look, we don't have all the answers. No one has all the answers, but I think what I would love to make sure that we impart with your listeners is that there are a lot of us out here trying. And I think we've come a fair distance in terms of being able to deal with some of these more thorny matters associated with AI. Our DOD uses some of our stuff as I know. I think the statement, I've had to check with our Fed folks, but I think the statement is SAS is used at every cabinet level department for mission critical activities, as well as all 50 state governments. So, we've been around for quite some time. We've learned a lot over that time, and we're trying to continue to bring the benefit of those learnings to the government so that that gets extended to the citizens of the country. So that's why we're in it.
Great perspective.
Yep.
Well, unfortunately, Reggie, we're running out of time here.
Yep.
You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Reggie Townsend, Vice President Data Ethics at SAS. Thanks, Reggie.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Federal Tech Podcast. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.